In this video, we'll look at using state standards as a publisher. We'll see how state standards appear for publishers and instructors, and look at some different ways to add them to questions. You can assign multiple state standards to a question, and instructors will only see the standards for their state. In this example, I have a question that has state standards for Ohio, California, and Florida assigned to it. Right now, I'm viewing this question as a publisher, so I see all the state standards the question is tagged with. Let's look at the content as instructors from different states and see what they see. Before we do, let's note that the Ohio standard ID is BH2 and the California standard is LS1. I've logged in as an instructor from Ohio. Let's take a look at what the state standards look like for them. Let's open the first chapter. Right now, the set isn't showing any question information other than the answers. Let's click the Display Question Information button and turn on the state standards. In the Question Display Options dialog, we'll select the State/Region Standards checkbox and click OK. When we were logged in as a publisher user, we saw standards for 3 states: Ohio, California, and Florida. Now that we're logged in as an instructor from Ohio, we only see one standard, the one for Ohio. Another thing to notice is that the country and state don't display for an instructor. Only the ID and standard description show. Now we're logged in as an instructor from California. Let's open Chapter 1 for this instructor. They see the state standard LS1, the California state standard, but not the Ohio standard. Finally, let's look at an instructor from Massachusetts. Notice that we only see the answers. Let's check to make sure that the state standards are displaying. The state standards are turned on. Since the state standards are set to display, and we're not seeing them, that means the questions aren't tagged with standards for our state. That makes sense because when we viewed the content as a publisher, there were only state standards for Ohio, California, and Florida. This instructor is in Massachusetts. We've seen how state standards will display for instructors based on their school state. Now, let's look at how to add state standards to a question. First, we're going to import some state standards so they're available in the system. We can add standards to the database one at a time as we tag questions. But if you have a team of people working on the content, sometimes it's helpful to have the standards loaded in advance. Here is a spreadsheet I've created with Florida standards. It has a column for the country, the 2-letter state abbreviation, standard ID, and the standard description. I've saved the spreadsheet as a CSV file that I can import into the system. It's important to have meaningful column headings because we'll need to map the data in this file to the columns in the database. To import our standards, we'll start by right-clicking any of the folders. Then I'll click Import Global Standards. We'll click the Type drop-down list and select State Standard. Next, we'll click Choose File and select the CSV file I created earlier. After selecting the file, we'll click Upload. The file type drop-down defaults to a CSV file, which is what we have. Also, the File Has Headers checkbox is selected. Our file has headers, so we'll leave that as is and click Next. Our next step is to match the columns in our spreadsheet to the corresponding columns in the database. In the first column, there are drop-downs for the database columns associated with state standards. The 4 other columns are samples of the data in our spreadsheet. Each column represents a row in our spreadsheet. In the first of the 4 columns, the original name column, we can see the column headings from our spreadsheet. The next 3 columns show samples of the standards data that we'll be importing. These 4 columns help us make sure that we're putting the data from the spreadsheet in the right place. What we'll do now is match our spreadsheet columns to the corresponding database columns. Let's start by selecting the drop-down next to our country row. Notice that there are 4 options, which are the 4 pieces of data used to define a state standard. Because of how we set up our spreadsheet, these match up perfectly with our columns. Let's select country from the list. Now the country column in our spreadsheet is matched to the country column in the database. Next, we'll click the drop-down for the second row, which corresponds to the state column in our spreadsheet. We'll select state region from the drop-down. Finally, let's match the ID and description with the correct columns. Now that we have mapped all the columns in our spreadsheet, let's click Import. After the import is finished, we can click OK. And then Done. Now that we've imported the state standards, authors tagging the questions can simply enter the standard ID to add it to a question. There are many ways to add state standards to questions. The first way is to add them to questions one at a time. You can do this by clicking Info and Objectives on the Info tab when you're writing or editing a question. But for this example, we're going to access the question information dialog from the editor pane. Let's click the pencil icon and select Edit Info. We'll scroll down in the question information dialog box until we get to the state standards. We want to add standards for Ohio and Florida. Let's start with the Ohio standard. I'll select the state region field and enter the state abbreviation for Ohio. Then I'll click Add Record. I imported the Ohio standards earlier. Now I'm going to enter the ID for the standard I want to add. Because I've imported the Ohio standards already, I don't need to enter the description. I'll click Update and the description will auto-populate. Notice that the description has been filled in automatically. Now let's add a Florida standard. We'll start by typing the state abbreviation for Florida in the state region field. Then we'll click Add Record. Because we've already imported the Florida standards, I just have to enter the ID and click Update. Again, the description displays automatically. Let's click OK to save the question information. Now the state standards for Ohio and Florida display. Because I'm working as a publisher user, both state standards display. Remember that for instructors, they will only see the standards specific to their state. While using the question information dialog box can be helpful if you have a few questions to tag, if you are assigning multiple state standards to each question in a set, you'll want a more efficient way to apply the standards. Luckily, you can tag a batch of questions using a spreadsheet. First, we'll need a list of question IDs. We can do that by exporting a spreadsheet of question information for the set. Let's click the Set menu, and then Manage Question Information. And finally, we'll click Export. We want to add state standards, so we'll select the State Region checkbox and then click OK. A spreadsheet with the selected question information will be exported. Let's take a look at the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet has columns for the question ID, language, question title, country, state region, state standard ID, and standard description. We have already tagged a couple of questions with state standards, so we can use that information to help us fill out the rest of the spreadsheet. For example, there are 3 rows for the question with the ID that ends in NC1B. If we look at the state standard section of the spreadsheet, we can see that the question has been tagged with standards for Ohio, Florida, and California. So if we want to tag questions with multiple state standards, we'll need a row with the question ID for each standard we want to add. Let's see how we can add the Ohio and Florida standards to the question in row 7, which doesn't currently have any state standards. First, let's right-click the row number to select the entire row. Then, we'll click Copy. Next, we'll right-click the next row and select Insert Copied Cells. Now we have 2 rows for the same question ID that we can use for the 2 state standards. We're going to tag this question with the same standards as the question above. So let's select the cells containing the country, state, and standard ID for that question and copy them. Because the standards are already in the database, we don't have to select the descriptions. Now let's select the state standard country cell in the first row for the question we're tagging. Now we have the Ohio and Florida standards assigned to that question. We can follow the same procedure to add the two state standards to the next question. We could continue this procedure to tag all the questions. We've been copying IDs used on other questions, but we could also use other standard IDs not used in the set. If the standard is already in the database, you just have to include the country, state, and ID. If the standard is not in the database yet, then you need to include the description as well. I've filled out the spreadsheet for the rest of the questions. Now, let's upload the question information to the set. With the set open, we'll click the Set menu. Then we'll select the Manage Question Information option. And then we'll select Import. We'll click Choose File. We'll select the updated spreadsheet we exported and click Open. Next, we'll click Upload. The import log shows how many rows were processed and if there were any errors. It looks like everything imported fine. Let's click Done. Let's scroll through the set and check the updates. By using a spreadsheet, we were able to add standards for two states much faster than tagging questions individually. And those are some of the ways you can use state standards in your questions.